It's the week ending Friday the 29th of November, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Storm Bird battering the UK and claiming the lives of 5 people, a ceasefire agreed between Israel and Hezbollah after 13 months, and Glastonbury announcing Rod Stewart will play next year's Legend slot at the age of 80. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Harriet Marsden and Rebekah Evans. And from Daily History podcast Today in History with the Retrospectors, it's Arion McNicoll. Before we get going, everybody, a controversial issue in my house I'd like you to help me decide. Is it time to put a Christmas tree up already? And is yours up?
No.
No and no.
Firm views.
Absolutely not.
And I think it's relevant to say that I am one of those people that's obsessed with Christmas and loves putting up Christmas decorations. And if
you want to keep it special by restricting it to December, right?
Yeah, if I'm saying it's too early, it's really too early.
December 1st is the first day that Christmas tree should be up. Anything before that is sacrilege.
Unacceptable. Arion.
Okay, well, I'm going to be the dissenting voice on this one and say yes and no. We have been intending to put up our Christmas tree, so yes in principle, but no, we haven't got round to it due to sort of chaos and disorganisation.
Okay, well, something else that happens on December the 1st is, of course, World AIDS Day. Harriet, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
The fall and rise of HIV.
This is an incredible piece of work, because if a person's not infected, then they can infect other people. If we can get the cost down and really get the acceptance up, you could substantially reduce the number of people getting HIV.
Bill Gates on his YouTube channel on Tuesday. Harriet, what's he talking about?
Well, he's talking about Lenacapavir, which is this incredible new antiviral injection that provides basically immunity from HIV. So we'll talk about that a bit later, but we're talking about HIV this week because this massive study came out analysing the rates of HIV in 204 countries between 1990 and 2021. It's this massive, massive global study. And it showed that globally new infections from HIV have dropped by a fifth, and HIV-related deaths fell by 40%, largely thanks to the success of preventative treatments.
Some good news on the show.
Some good news.
It's not often we come with a study.
The first time in months I've come to you with good news. Fewer people contracted HIV last year than at any point since the start of the pandemic in the 1980s.
But it's success. But of course, it's also success for the virus, isn't it? To say that HIV is still a big problem. How big a problem is it worldwide?
Yeah, so this is where all the caveats come in. It's an enormous problem worldwide. 40 million people are living with HIV. It's also, although fewer people contracted it last year than at any point since the rise, there's lots of regions all over the world, including in Europe, but also Asia and Africa and the Middle East, that are seeing increasing rates of infections and deaths. So when I said that 40 million people are living with HIV, reached that in 2021, that's up from 30 million in 2010. So it's a significant increase. The study suggests that very few countries are on track to reach this massive global target that we have, which is the UN target of, by 2030, basically ending the HIV epidemic as a public health threat. So reducing the rates of infection and also reducing the related deaths by 90% from 2010 levels. So what we're talking about basically is a massive decrease, but also an increase elsewhere and nowhere near a fast enough decrease.
And when it comes to all those different countries, Arion, is it a level playing field? Are the treatments for HIV readily available for everyone around the world?
No, absolutely not. And unfortunately, the access to the treatments that are available are very unequal. So, not surprisingly, wealthier nations continue to benefit significantly while poorer countries are struggling, largely due to the high costs associated with the medication. So, Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, which is home to 25 million people living with HIV at the moment, has really tried to scale up its antiretroviral therapy programs, but it just just struggles with both limited healthcare infrastructure as well as frequent stock problems, and then on top of that, massive stigma associated with HIV/AIDS. And then you have in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, for example, antiretroviral coverage is among the lowest globally due to political instability, and then also these kind of underfunded healthcare systems and also punitive laws that target marginalized groups like drug users and also LGBTQ plus individuals. Same thing in the Middle East and North Africa, and other regions have their own distinct issues. So yes, there's lots and lots of new drugs that are available, like the thing that Bill Gates was talking about at the top of the clip, but they're just not being distributed in equal quantities around the world.
Yeah, and even in the US, Rebekah, it's taken some time on certain issues for that stigma to go away. There's some news this month around organ transplants there.
Yeah, it's very interesting what's currently unfolding in the United States when it comes to HIV. So previously, transplants of that kind could only be done as part of research studies, but this new rule is essentially shortening the wait for organs for all people, regardless of their HIV status. Now, obviously, doctors will face certain hurdles, even with the advancements that have come into play, particularly for HIV people. There are various vulnerabilities to bear in mind. The immune system seems to be the biggest hurdle there, because HIV impacts the immune system and the transplantation process can become more complicated as a result of that. But this is a really interesting development that could really help people who are living with HIV, and, as Arion briefly touched upon there, potentially help to reduce some of the stigma that's still associated with the condition.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of extraordinary to me, Harriet, that it took until 2024 to say that people with HIV in the US could get an organ from someone else with HIV. I mean, you understand the concern, obviously, that there would have been, particularly in the 80s and 90s, about people with HIV giving organ donations at all in case they ended up in the bodies of someone who didn't have HIV. But we're in 2024. Why has it taken so long?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't that long ago that in the UK, men who had sex with men and gay men and weren't typically allowed to give blood donations. You know, it's not that long ago that changed. And it was, there was no reason for that to still be the case when they test the blood the way they do.
Did you know, I didn't know that had changed, because the last time I gave blood, I was asked that question, which shows how long it's been since I've given blood.
It's an extraordinary thing that, I mean,
need to get on that.
It was, I think it was 2010 in South Africa where they first showed that you could use HIV positive donor organs safely in people with HIV. So that's a long time ago. And this has actually been allowed to be done in the US since 2013, but only for research studies. So this is the first time when they've lifted the ban to allow it on living donors and recipients, basically. So yeah, it's difficult for us to have a perspective on just how much stigma still persists, and not just worldwide, but in countries like very developed countries. I mean, among gay men and men who have sex with men, HIV prevalence rates, they're 5 times higher in countries with laws that criminalize same-sex relationships than in those that don't. So what I think we're trying to get across with this story here is that this is about so much more than the availability of treatment. It's also about political will, it's also about access, and it's really still about stigma.
But actually, Rebekah, despite those issues in countries where same-sex relationships are prohibited, the rise in diagnoses that we're seeing in HIV is actually amongst heterosexual people in many countries. That might surprise some listeners.
Yeah, and that's specifically the case in the UK, actually. I found it interesting to read. So there's been a rise in HIV diagnosis, particularly amongst heterosexual men and women, and I think that's interesting because obviously historically, whether rightly or wrongly, obviously not entirely correctly, this is a condition that has been associated with men who have sex with men, gay men, for example. But I think that there are several factors as to why HIV diagnoses are on the rise for heterosexual men and women. I think firstly, testing rates continue to remain low for heterosexual people when we compare that to gay and bisexual men. And then we had the pandemic, obviously, that disrupted testing services. Even in the years since, really, testing levels haven't returned to where they were before the pandemic. And then we look at issues like funding cuts. Many sexual health clinics are closing for a variety of reasons, but funding cuts are obviously a huge issue that the government is grappling with. These sexual health clinics obviously were such an important place for people to receive free and confidential HIV testing. So their closure means that it's harder for people to get tests. That obviously leads to undiagnosed cases of HIV and people missing out on the treatment that they need.
And just coming back to that question of stigma as well, it's really properly important. There was this really quite moving preamble to a recent UN AIDS report by Elton John, who wrote that for him, he said, "I know the feeling of shame and what it can do. As long as HIV is seen as a disease for others, not so-called decent people, AIDS will not be beaten." He said, "Science, medicine, and technology will be the what of ending AIDS, but inclusion, empathy, and compassion are the how." And I thought that's a really important statement about the fact that stigma is continuing to drive the problem in so many parts of the world. But I think another big problem, and kind of what brings us back to this really important report that is saying that infection rates are dropping, but not at the rate that is going to help us meet the targets that the world has set for itself, is that one of the big problems has long been complacency. And I think that the world has started to feel as though this is a condition that is now on the run, that thanks to the developments that science has brought us, we actually have this thing under control. But actually, the situation is that it still needs people to continue to pay attention to it and to continue to specifically distribute the drugs that we have available to us at a level that everyone can afford them.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the what, though. Tell us about this new drug that Bill Gates was talking about in the video we played there.
Yeah, so it's basically this summer, these results came out of this massive clinical trial in Africa about this twice a year injection. It gave young women total protection from HIV. So all of them were immune. It's basically a long-acting pre-exposure prophylactic injectable. So it's very similar to the PrEP treatment that we have available here on the NHS since 2020, but it's a twice-yearly injection. And the reason why that's so exciting is because there are already daily pills that can be taken. I think there are two. There's Truvada and Descovy. But firstly, this injection is far more effective. So it covered all the women rather than leaving out 1% or 2%. In fact, the early results were so amazing, they actually stopped the trial early to give all the participants the injection. But the problem with these daily pills is that uptake is really bad, especially among young African women. And that's where most of this rise is, in sub-Saharan Africa among young women and girls. Just one stat that really jumped out at me, that every single day last year, 570 young women and girls between 15 and 24 years old got HIV. Every single day, 570. And in 22 African countries, women and girls in that age group are like 3 times more likely than their male peers to be living with HIV. So this is a massively gendered issue because it's all sorts of things like access to education and stigma and gender-based violence that are impeding access. And the reason they think that these injections will have a much better uptake is because it's much easier to go to a clinic twice a year for an injection. No stigma, no obvious queuing in a clinic every day for pills or taking pills every day. They think that the uptake will be massively better. The question obviously is going to still be the cost, because Lenacapavir is extraordinarily expensive. It's actually approved as a treatment in the US and it's really expensive. So it's a question of what scale we can get it, or whether they can, the manufacturers can kind of release the patent and all sorts of things.
It's also, I mean, this is a dark thing to think about, but in the context that you were just describing of relationships perhaps where women don't have control, perhaps having unprotected sex against their will as well, it's more discreet, isn't it?
It's absolutely more discreet, yeah.
You can leave the house twice a year and your partner won't know.
But just coming back to what we were saying about the UK, there is another side to it as well. There was this thing launched in 2022, the opt-out bloodborne virus testing in emergency rooms. So some of that rise in diagnosis is because more blood is getting tested in emergency rooms, which is good. That is a good thing. But obviously then on the other side, more than half the STI clinics in the UK have closed since the pandemic. In 4 years, more than half of our STI clinics have closed. Obviously, that has massive implications for access to treatment and testing, but also wider on like gynecological services, counselling after sexual assault, violence, that kind of thing. Like there's implications here that go far beyond HIV treatment, but it's really, really, really difficult for people to get. I mean, nearly a tenth of the STI clinics that are still left are so understaffed and so much funding cut that they can't actually provide the PrEP treatment that the NHS is supposed to provide.
And why then have you chosen this as your story of the week? As I said, World AIDS Day is around the corner, but it's not just that, is it? You feel this might be a turning point?
The reason that I think it affects all of us is firstly, the perception that the stigma is over is an incorrect one. Just because rates are falling and just because we have treatments available and more treatments coming does not mean that there isn't still stigma, and it doesn't mean that there isn't still access issues and political issues and legal framework issues and all sorts of funding stuff that stops people getting, like Arion was saying with Elton John's quote, that we might be getting a lot closer with the science and the medicine and the technology, but we shouldn't be complacent thinking that the stigma is gone, and we shouldn't be complacent thinking that the access is equal. Because also the problem in the UK specifically is that still so much of the marketing around testing and treatment is basically projected towards men who have sex with men and gay men. Whereas actually, if we're seeing a massive increase in diagnoses among straight people, particularly ethnic minorities, which is the far steepest rise, we're not necessarily reaching the people with the messaging that we need to reach. And just as a sort of point to end on, the UK's longest known survivor of HIV, who's John Percy, who's from Truro, he said, so he was actually the 13th person in the UK to be diagnosed in 1981, and he was given 2 years to live, and he's now 43 years later.
Wow.
He's got undetectable HIV. And I think that what he said about over all that time, he said very little has changed about how the disease is viewed. He says he gets lots of verbal and physical abuse. He's targeted by people in the street. He's spat on. He's called a paedophile. He said it's still classed as a gay disease in a very pejorative way. So we shouldn't think that the stigma isn't also in the UK too.
Okay. Up next, the story that brings together Sinead O'Connor, Olly Mann and Michael Burke. That's after this. Okay, Arion, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week we learnt that 40 years later, Bob Geldof is still trying to work out if Africans know that it's Christmas.
That's it. That sounds good. We're going to try the chorus. There's a lot of voices on it anyway, but just to hear you with them.
Okay, cool. Let's do it again.
In our world of plenty, but say a prayer.
Let me know when to come in.
Because I'm proud to be here and I'm loving life. Can I go from the top?
Okay, let's have another bash.
Some iconic voices from 1984 to the present day there. We're talking Band-Aid, of course. That was Band-Aid 2024, which is a 40th anniversary that the charity posted on Monday. Arion, why your story of the week?
So the 40th anniversary version of this song is a multi-decade spanning mega mix of the original 1984 hit song, Do They Know It's Christmas? And the new track blends vocals from all the different versions of the single that have been recorded down the decades.
I'm going to correct you on that. It doesn't include the Stock Aitken and Waterman version, which I personally feel is an omission. But obviously Bob Geldof had no personal control over. Anyway, carry on.
Okay, well, so what it does mean is the coming together of stars including George Michael, Sinead O'Connor, Bono and Harry Styles. And even though the song has been around for ages and has been variously lauded and criticised in equal measure pretty much since it first emerged, the 40th anniversary remix has been subject to a new controversy because it was denounced by Ed Sheeran, who said that his voice had been used without permission, and had he been asked, he would have said no. And the comments kind of went on to reignite a long-standing debate over whether the song should remain a staple of the festive season or whether it should be finally retired altogether.
Yeah, so, I mean, you say used without his permission. Obviously, Ed Sheeran consented to participating in a Band-Aid song. What was that, the 2014 version, I presume?
That's the one. Yep.
But now says he has a more developed understanding of the way that the lyrics are interpreted. What did he mean?
Well, what he said was that if he had been given a choice this year, he would have respectfully declined the use of my vocals. And he said partly his views had been influenced by the Ghanaian English Afrobeats star Fuse ODG, who declined to participate in the 2014 recording that Sheeran was in, and more recently has stepped up his own personal criticism and has been saying that the song pushes racist stereotypes that, quote, stifle Africa's economic growth, tourism and investment, ultimately costing the continent trillions and destroying its dignity, pride and identity. And Fuse ODG has further said that the song smacks of colonialism and white saviorism, and that, he said, African problems should be solved by Africans. And this year he released his own song, We Know It's Christmas, and said that proceeds from that song will go to innovative local projects in Africa. Geldof has responded to all of that, and he's basically said that, look, his work is, in fact, he said, quote, it's exactly what Fuse is saying. He said that over the years he's sought out African investment partners and he's been trying to involve more and more people from across the African continent. And according to Geldof, he said, you inject the oil of cash into an economy and people thrive. So I am 100% with the arguments of Fuse ODG. So even Geldof himself is trying to come around to this point of view.
Yeah, I mean, the point is, Rebekah, that the lyrics were written in a rush in 1984 when everyone in Britain had just seen this horrific, devastating report on the news by Michael Burke of the famine in Ethiopia and wanted to do something. And at the time, it was very well understood that, something as simple as do they know it's Christmas, as Arion was just saying, the riposte is yes, they do, because there are many Christians in Ethiopia. I mean, it was very clear that the meaning was, can they celebrate Christmas when they're starving to death? I mean, that's what it meant in 1984. Do you think there's an issue with the song itself continuing to be revived? Because the bottom line is, it is getting played. The 1984 version's on the radio all the time.
It is getting played a lot. The original version is getting played a lot. And I distinctly remember the first time that I really my eyes opened to the kind of problematic nature of this song was I was at a university Christmas event. And they were playing the song. I did know it was Christmas at this event, and they were playing the song, and people were dancing to it, and it made my body just cringe. I just felt so deeply, deeply uncomfortable that this is a song that is continuing to be revived over and over and over again. Yes, it was formulated quickly, so it could be released quickly, and for better or worse, the song has raised a lot of money. $150 million. That is obviously a lot of money. But my opinion on this issue is I really dislike the song. I think all of the lyrics have major issues in terms of stereotypes, particularly the famous "Well, tonight, thank God it's them instead of you" line. I just have always been deeply uncomfortable with that. But I think with the constant revival of this song, my opinion is that once you know better, you should do better. So it's now understood on a much wider scale that the lyrics and the imagery of Band-Aid is problematic. We've had 40 years to get ourselves used to that idea, wrap our heads around it, hear opinions from people from the African diaspora. They are telling you that it's a problematic song. So when a group of people is going through a crisis, to me, we should be asking them how we can help them and not forcing our ideas on how best to help. So I think Geldof, we can say that he did his best at the time, with the limited time that he had and the worldview of the 80s. But I think what's best now is to retire the song, let it be what it was in 1984, and just move on, not a constant reboot and Geldof trying to push his opinion down our throats every year. It's getting tiresome.
Well, let's imagine yourself to be Bob Geldof, Harriet, which isn't something that I spend a lot of time doing. But if you did, you have this enormous project that has generated millions of pounds for charity. And you, as the sort of, figurehead of this and highly involved with it, have seen the good that it's done, presumably. And so you have a choice, don't you, as you come up to the 40th anniversary. You've heard all the arguments Rebekah's just made, as she's just illustrated, from lots of people. You understand them, but you are actually then choosing, okay, well, I won't do anything and I won't raise an extra however millions of dollars for for a charity that I think is worthwhile. You'd be choosing not to raise money if you didn't make a 40th anniversary video.
You actually wouldn't, because the Band-Aid Charitable Trust last year helped fund meals for more than 100,000 school children affected by the civil war in Tigray in Ethiopia. So you actually wouldn't stop making money if you didn't
but you'd be
do
choosing
this.
not to make an extra, however much more this extra remix makes, you'd be choosing not to put in the bank.
Yeah, to go back to your point about imagining I was Bob Geldof, I'd actually much rather imagine I was Paula Yates, who was his partner at the time and is considered to be the brains behind the whole initiative, or the culprit, depending on how you look at it, and actually was the force that helped inspire Geldof to rally all of these famous people. So let's just pretend that I'm Paula Yates rather than Bob Geldof, firstly. But I think what is interesting is the perspective of the Ethiopians, not just in the diaspora, but also in Ethiopia itself at the moment, like the Prime Minister, for example. So this is where I really hit the wall, because you can have all these debates about the enduring impact, for good or for bad, of this song, and how much money it raised, and the impact, and how incredible it was for people under what was then a military dictatorship, and the propaganda telling them that nobody around the world cared about their plight. The impact that had of all of these famous people, and airplanes over Addis Ababa dropping cake, dropping sweets, like all of this incredible impact, and the money raised, and the recognition, and all of the awareness. But now, 40 years later, I mean, they've already done this for the 20th and 30th year anniversary as well. But now the Ethiopian Prime Minister himself is telling you, please don't do this. This is where I'm hitting the wall with it. Like, he said, please don't mark the 40th anniversary with a re-release and a call for donations. He said it's frustrating to see our nation's ancient history and culture reduced to doom and gloom. He did say that the 80s version was well-meaning at the time, but he said that a good cause that has not evolved with the times might end up doing more harm than good. Like, Ethiopia is now one of Africa's fastest growing economies. It's got like these amazing ancient sites. It's got the biggest hydropower project in Africa. It's not great PR for what the investment and the image it's trying to project. And we now know, there was a report that came out a few weeks ago about how many billions negative stereotypes and portrayals of African nations cost the country in foreign aid development and investment. It costs billions per year, all of these negative stereotypes that we reinforce with this sort of thing. And so, yeah, I think at this point, if the Ethiopian Prime Minister, who, by the way, is a Nobel Peace Prize recipient himself, is telling you, please don't do this, then I think it demonstrates an incredible amount of arrogance and really reinforces the accusations of white saviorism to do so.
So that was a long answer, but it was basically, yes, I would have made the choice not to make the video. Arion, if you were Bob Geldof, what choice would you have made?
I understand the point that you're making, that, you know, he's got this charitable ball rolling, and the choice is, do you stop it or do you keep it going? And I think that's quite complicated by the fact that even though there, you know, more money in the coffers means more projects that can distribute that money across the continent of Africa, and that is good, but I think it's being weighed against the full damage of everything that Harriet's talking about, which is all of these stereotypes that, you know, the world has been coming to terms with over the last 40 years. And by now, and at some point, you know, at some point this song does have to be retired. I think it's really interesting that Geldof himself is now talking about the song in totally different terms. And he, this year, has come out trying to say that it's a, quote, a tiny piece of British rock and roll history on this one record. It transcribes the arc of British rock and roll over 40 years. And then he points out that on this one record, you get to hear a young Rita Ora with a young Sting, with a young Harry Styles and Sinead O'Connor, Bananarama, Boy George, George Michael, you know, and I think it's interesting. This is an interesting new take from Geldof, that he's wanting to position the song as a kind of modern standard that has been contributed to by the great and the good of British rock history. And he's not wrong. You know, some of the coming together of those voices I find a little bit magical and also a bit eerie when you watch the video too, not least because quite a lot of the people have now passed away. But on the other hand, it's a shame that they weren't singing a better song. Don't you think? Like, had they all been contributing to a song that A, was a better song and B, was less problematic, then I think that those voices together would be a much less difficult listen than what we're left with.
Well, I mean, you're saying it's not a good song. I totally understand what you're saying lyrically. It obviously is a fantastic pop song, Rebekah, from the point that it is still being played every year on commercial radio stations, which themselves would only play it if the audience wanted to hear it. I mean, it is on and on and on. So it is a Christmas standard. It is up there with, you know, Wizard and Slade and all the rest of it. And to Arion's point of it has to be retired. Well, those haven't been. You know, I've presented shows on Magic at Christmas time. They're still playing Bing Crosby, right? They play songs that are 70 years old. It won't get retired. It's with us, isn't it?
It's a brainworm. Of course it's a brainworm. I mean, it's been stuck in my head for the whole week and I absolutely loathe the song. So it clearly does something psychologically that is catchy. But I just feel like we have to circle back to the fact that the song is problematic. Bing Crosby is not problematic. Wizard is not problematic. Slade is not problematic. All of these songs have endured for so many years because we can get some level of enjoyment out of it. There's no level of enjoyment that I can get out of Do They Know It's Christmas other than being very uncomfortable about the lyrics and the message and the fact that it just keeps getting revived over and over again. I'm
not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying the evidence shows. I mean, Fairy Tale of New York has a gay slur in it, doesn't it? That's still on the radio every year as well. Like, people can point out they're problematic, but at Christmas, people play the same songs they listen to when they were kids. That's just what happens.
Yeah, it does. And I mean, people are more than welcome to play the song if they so choose. I mean, it's free will. Everyone can play whatever songs they want to. But yeah, I certainly won't be playing it on purpose over Christmas. And I'm very, very persuaded by the arguments that we should just retire the song altogether.
Do you have a favourite Christmas song that you play instead, by the way?
I think you've got to go with Mariah Carey, haven't you? Really?
I think that is the right answer, although I've got a soft spot for Leona Lewis. Harriet?
You sort of, I think, forgot as well, there's like what you're saying is the basis of the ad populum fallacy, that just because something is incredibly popular doesn't necessarily mean it's good. Or as Superhan said in Peep Show, people like Coldplay and voted for the Nazis. You can't trust people. But my problem with this song is less how it's aged or whether or not it's good, but more that it was always inaccurate. Like, this is what was really interesting when I was researching this, actually. I don't know how many people know this. I did not know this. Ethiopia was actually one of the first countries in the world to adopt Christmas. They adopted
That's not what Do They Know It's Christmas means, as I explained.
325 AD adopted Christmas. England was still a pagan country 2.5 centuries after that. So Christmas was huge for Ethiopian history. And they actually follow the Julian Orthodox calendar, so they celebrate it on the 7th of January. But when this song was recorded, they were under a military dictatorship and were not allowed to celebrate religious festivals. So very much they did know it's Christmas, but very much were not allowed to celebrate it. So it's like, even the original, they could have looked that up. Like, they really could have just looked that up.
I think it's very clearly a rhetorical question. It has a question mark at the end. You're allowed to answer yes, they do. Arion, more broadly than this, charities are having to navigate a path around what can be seen as, and what has come to be seen as, an exploitative othering of the people that they are raising funds for. This affects lots of campaigns, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that's right. You know, celebrities now view charitable endorsements very much as a key part of their whole profile, but they do have to be quite cautious about skipping over or making sure that they're not appearing in problematic ways that have become increasingly scrutinized, like that sort of the vision of the white savior coming to Africa, holding up a malnourished child and being seen to give several children cake and then walking away. I think that's become a huge part of charities' engagement with the very thing that they're trying to make some sort of a positive impact on. So it's not a minefield for no reason. It's important that people bear in mind the way that they are wading into whatever issue they're trying to solve. But at the same time, yes, of course, it's a minefield. And for a charity that was built, predicated on a thing that, you know, has been increasingly problematized over the years, you can see why Geldof's sort of struggling with this one.
Yeah, I also think there's the issue of, you know, this so-called poverty porn issue, you know, exploiting the conditions of a vulnerable group of people, particularly the poor, to generate sympathy for charity. You know, I think about, you know, the sad piano music or the, you know, violin strings and black and white footage and all of that stuff. It's essentially reducing the recipients of these donations to victims. It's not giving them their full humanity, and that's an enduring problem, obviously.
Okay. To tea or not to tea? That is the question after this. Rebekah, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is trouble brewing in Britain's love affair with tea?
Brasses, which once adorned snorting shire horses, and pewter mugs and plates, all of them telling the story of changing habits in the English home. A silver Georgian teapot tells how sailing clippers brought a precious new cargo from the east to form a new English habit. Today, when the kettle sings and the clock strikes, yes, it's time to follow that new English habit. Only 2.5 centuries new. Afternoon tea.
A 1945 commercial for Maypole Tea. Not the sponsors of the show this week. But good to see that you've got your finger on the pulse of the news this week, Rebekah. What's the story?
Well, it seems as if Britain's tea obsession might just be cooling off. Once the cornerstone of British culture and identity, it seems like the cuppa is losing a bit of steam as we opt for coffee and G&Ts instead.
Okay. You've done the puns, give us the stats. What's happened?
Several tea brands have been facing issues recently. British brand Typhoo has filed for administration last week. But what I think is the final steep is the fact that this week's UK shop inflation data has shown that the price of tea is a key factor which is driving inflation higher by 1.2% specifically this month. So it really made me wonder this week, what's really brewing, and could this mark the end of tea as our national drink?
So you can take the writer off the typewriter, but finish that sentence for yourself. The thing is, though, if you say that the price of tea is affecting inflation for everybody, doesn't that just underline the fact that tea is an essential commodity that we use to measure our economy? Like, it's having an impact because everyone picks up some tea when they're in the supermarket, right?
Well, yeah, to a certain extent. I think it's interesting because the popularity of tea as a whole has not necessarily waned. It's black tea specifically that is having issues right now. Difficulties have surfaced for various brands when it comes to the sales of everyday black tea specifically. So we look at brands like PG Tips and Yorkshire Tea. Recent figures show that sales of black tea dropped by 6% in 2022, and that means black tea sales have fallen behind sales of specialty teas for the first time ever. So it's specifically black tea that is having an issue at the moment, which is breaking my heart a little bit, Ollie, to be honest.
Harriet, what do you think is causing the rise in prices, and what does it mean for the people who grow the tea?
Well, there's all sorts of issues. It's kind of a mix of global disruption. There's all sorts of instability in the Red Sea and the Suez Canal that's massive knock-on to trade and shipping and causing all sorts of bottleneck supply chain issues. But it's climate change. It's this devastating, extreme, deadly heat waves this year, particularly in India. India's where we get most of our tea. We're their top export destination for tea. And this year they had, extraordinarily deadly droughts and massive flooding in the Assam region, which kind of does, I think, about more than half their tea output. But also there are some other things at play here, specifically in the Indian tea industry, that could actually be really interesting, because their tea industry has been struggling for a decade with all the production costs are rising. But if the price of tea hasn't really risen, and it hasn't, maybe higher prices could help support that. Like maybe some of it will feed back to the workers. And then also some of it is to do with the fact that the government banned like 20 pesticides. So production took a massive hit this year because of that. So that could actually be a good overall net benefit to the environment as well.
If tea gets more expensive. But then, Typhoo, the brand that's in trouble that Rebekah referenced there, you go on their website and their whole pitch is about we support people in Kenya who grow our tea. That's why our tea costs more. It doesn't say that, but that's effectively what they're getting at. Mm-hmm. And that's the case for all of the big brands. They will justify their higher costs. But actually people are choosing the supermarket-owned brands. The customer is choosing against that.
Yeah, so I was just going to say as well that the post-Brexit trade hurdles are a really big factor here. It actually just costs so much more to get anything into the UK that doesn't come from the UK. So Brexit is playing a huge part there, and they can't really slap that on a tea box. Like they're not doing the marketing that they want to do there. But also, it's a rise of the wellness industry as well. People are choosing herbal teas. They're choosing coffee it's more glamorous, it's more exciting, more interesting, it's more youth orientated. Kind of a tea bag. If it's not super cheap anymore, and it isn't, then it's like, well, you might as well have something a bit nicer, a bit more fun. I mean, I'm biased here because I'm not a black tea drinker. I'm a coffee drinker. So I'm standing with all the young Gen Zs who are now buying coffee in way higher rates than tea. But also another fun stat that came out recently was 44% of people surveyed said that they would opt for a G&T versus 41% that said they would have a cup of tea with their friends. So also there's that as well. I would rather have a G&T.
11 in the morning.
I would definitely rather have a G&T at 11 in the morning than have a black tea.
Depends how hard of a week it's been.
It's just
you can't dunk a biscuit in a G&T.
There's all sorts of different issues here. Like the prices are rising at the same time as demand is falling. So you've kind of got a sort of perfect storm in a teacup.
Oh, I thought the puns had stopped.
I'm sorry. It was right there.
Arion, you are actually in the home of cool coffee, basically, aren't you? I mean, I know you're in Sydney rather than Melbourne, but still, Australia and the Italian immigrants to Australia have helped boom coffee all around the world, right? As the trendy young drink that Harriet was referring to. Is it your fault?
Well, first of all, that would be a red rag to a bull, that business of whether Sydney or Melbourne is the true home of coffee.
Didn't know what I was wading into. I mean, obviously it is Melbourne, but... Sorry,
it probably actually is Melbourne, but given I am representing Sydney, sure. It's Sydney. But definitely, I think I was actually reflecting on that exact coming together of booze and tea and coffee and these sort of new herbal teas and bubble teas and so on, and thinking about all of the things that made tea the so-called national drink of Britain for so long. And I think it had come to be a replacement for many different forms of intoxicant-based relief or release in the UK in particular, for things that in other countries people use a cigarette for, like a reward moment that I'll just do another hour's work and then I'll go get my cup of tea, where other people might choose cigarettes. And I think, Brits often do tend to meet for drinks of the alcoholic variety. When they go out, they sort of go out to have a drink in a way that in Australia you might go and have a coffee. But I think that the tea itself has long been this sort of it's had this association with homeliness and intimacy and welcoming and also comfort. It's this major comfort drink, and maybe it's that place that it is partially losing its market as well. That as people find different drinks that can carry out that role, the sort of chamomile or turmeric blend of tea that offers something that is also, health conscious, it can contribute to your digestive system or your immune system. I think that
it's by no means cheaper, by the way. And we were talking about how, the tea bag now seems expensive, but I mean, a Tea Pigs or a Pucker tea bag per tea bag is like twice the price, isn't it? So, I mean,
Absolutely. Yeah. And I really don't think that business of tea getting more expensive is the key driver behind the diminishing popularity.
Posh coffee is also
I think it is more to do with the fact, and also posh coffee, well, all coffee is threatened by climate change in the exact same way as tea is, and so its prices are rising at the same rate and threatening to go even higher. I don't think people are choosing this to drink coffee because it's less expensive than tea. It's because they prefer it, and I think that that's the thing that you can't find. That sort of consumer-based preference is not something that's going to be easily surmounted by this sort of dip in the tea industry.
Rebekah, you were welcoming the end of Do They Know It's Christmas, an iconic Christmas favourite. Do you also think it's time that Britain's favourite drink, had its death knell?
No, I don't. I mean, as the team will know, I'm one of the only tea drinkers in office. I'm flying the flag for tea. I love tea. Ever since I was small, I've loved tea. I like an Earl Grey. I like a nice tea.
What? Sorry, what little girl drinks Earl Grey? How old are you talking?
I know, absolutely. But my family used to joke that, as a 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old, I used to like an Earl Grey. So
wow.
It's deeply embedded within my soul, and I'm not willing to let go of tea yet. I mean, I've had my morning tea this morning. I will have a tea after we finish the podcast. I love tea.
So should there be intervention to save it then?
like I don't know.
Desperately
what
trying to
kind of
salvage a serious conversation
really.
at the end of this tea chat.
I don't know what kind of intervention there would be to save tea, to be honest. But I think if we're being serious and taking my nostalgia and my love for tea it's kind of out of this this discussion, I think there's cycles of popularity when it comes to anything, right? I think tea might fall out of popularity now. But it might, capture attention in the future. But I think, I don't want to say what's so great about tea, but what's so interesting about tea, particularly within the UK, is that it's such a great leveller.
Yes.
I think whether we're enjoying it from fine china like the Queen or an old chipped mug like the builder down the road, I think it's just something that we can all kind of unite on. And whether that's a tradition that kind of needs to be left in the past is obviously up to the listener to decide. But yeah, I think it's such an essential part of British culture that it would be a shame to kind of let it go.
Okay. Oh, I think we have stewed this bag long enough. But just before we go, I'm curious now, because we've been talking about tea for 5 minutes. If I'm off for a round of tea, how do you take it? Harriet, what's your order?
Herbal.
Wow. Just straight up,
Yeah.
never builder's tea.
I don't drink black tea at all. So
Right,
all
okay.
the rest of us in the office are going down for our coffee, and this one over here is faffing about with her tea bag.
I said Arion was the problem. You're the problem. Arion, how do you take your tea?
Yeah, if I had to drink tea, I'd go, like Harriet, I'd go something herbal. Licorice tea is the tea I prefer. If you're forcing me to drink black tea, I will have it with milk and no sugar, thanks.
Okay. And Rebekah, as the tea connoisseur.
Erring on the side of builders, but the tea bag has to go first, then the water, then the milk.
Yes, indeed. To all Americans listening, please take that as a warning. You're destroying our culture.
And Olly, what's yours?
Oh, but thank you for asking, Arion. I'm not consistent. Sometimes it's milk and 2 sugars. Sometimes it's just milk. Sometimes it's even black. What is important for me is the brand. If possible, Welsh brew. I wasn't a big fan of black tea at all.
Whoa.
Welsh brew, a time in Cardiff, changed everything.
Left the field.
On which we're going to have a tea break. That's it. My thanks to Arion, Rebekah and Harriet. You can follow this show for free. You can get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. Then tap follow. Remember, you can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription. All you need to do is go to theweek.com/subscriptions. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producers Ollie Peart and Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.